I watched my 7-year-old daughter Raven tear through the sparkly wrapping paper with the excitement she always had for packages, her small fingers working quickly to reveal whatever surprise my estranged parents had sent for her birthday. The smile on her face froze the moment she lifted the lid of the white box, her hands going completely still as she stared down at the contents. Her voice came out in a whisper that made my blood turn cold. "Mommy, what is this?" I leaned over to look and felt the air leave my lungs. Nestled in tissue paper was a framed photo of my parents with another little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting on my mother's lap in the same rocking chair where she used to hold Raven. Below the frame was a handwritten note in my mother's careful script that simply read, "Our new granddaughter, Isabella, the daughter we always wanted." The cruelty was so calculated, so precisely designed to wound both me and my child, that I had to grip the edge of the kitchen table to keep from falling. The morning routine in our small apartment had become sacred to me. Coffee brewing while Raven ate her cereal, cartoons playing softly in the background, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window that faced east. I worked as a night shift nurse at the county hospital, which meant our mornings together were precious before she went to school, and I tried to catch a few hours of sleep. She'd chatter about her dreams or her plans for recess while I braided her thick black hair. These quiet moments feeling like the most important work I'd ever done. At the hospital, I moved through the cardiac unit with practiced efficiency, checking on post-surgery patients, administering medications, charting vitals in the fluorescent-lit hallways that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax. My colleagues knew me as reliable, the one who stayed late when someone called in sick, who could handle the difficult families with patience. What they didn't know was that I'd learned to navigate emotional chaos long before I ever set foot in a medical setting. I'd been proud once of how I'd managed to break free from my parents' suffocating control, how I'd built this life for Raven and myself without their constant criticism and manipulation. Before she was born, I'd been the daughter who could never do anything right. My career choice wasn't prestigious enough. My apartment wasn't in a good enough neighborhood. My choice to have a child as a single mother was selfish and irresponsible. Walking away from them 3 years ago had felt like finally learning to breathe. If this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed. Sometimes the most important stories are the hardest ones to tell. The erosion had been so gradual I'd mistaken it for normal family dynamics for years. My parents, Carmen and Floyd, had always been controlling, but when Raven was born, their behavior shifted into something more insidious. Every parenting decision I made became grounds for criticism. I was too lenient when I comforted her, too strict when I set boundaries, too protective when I worried about her safety, too neglectful when I tried to give her independence. The first major incident happened when Raven was 3. I'd brought her to their house for Easter dinner, and she'd had a normal toddler meltdown when my father told her she couldn't have dessert before finishing her vegetables. Instead of understanding that this was typical behavior for her age, my mother launched into a lecture about how I was raising a spoiled brat, how children in her day knew how to behave properly. When I tried to defend my parenting approach, my father accused me of being defensive and said maybe I wasn't cut out for motherhood after all. The pattern escalated over the next few years. They'd invite us to family gatherings, then spend the entire time pointing out everything Raven was doing wrong. She was too loud, too quiet, too clingy, too independent. They'd make comments about her mixed heritage in front of other family members, suggesting that maybe that was why she was so difficult. When I finally confronted them about their constant negativity, they turned it around on me, saying I was too sensitive, that they were just trying to help me raise her properly. The final straw came during Raven's 4th birthday party. My mother had insisted on planning it at their house, promising it would be special. Instead, she spent the entire party comparing Raven unfavorably to my cousin's daughter, talking loudly about how some children were just naturally better behaved than others. When Raven started crying after being told she was being too messy while eating her own birthday cake, I packed up our things and left. That was 3 years ago, and we hadn't spoken since. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 days before Raven's 7th birthday. The return address was my parents' house, written in my mother's distinctive handwriting that I recognized immediately. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened. We'd been doing fine without their toxic presence in our lives, and Raven had stopped asking about Grandma and Grandpa months ago. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was hope or curiosity, or the small part of me that still wanted to believe they might have changed. I set the box on the kitchen counter and decided to let Raven open it when she got home from school. If it was an attempt at reconciliation, I wanted her to experience whatever joy might come from reconnecting with her grandparents. When she bounded through the door that afternoon, backpack sliding off her shoulder, her eyes immediately went to the wrapped package on the table. She asked if it was an early birthday present, and I told her it was from Grandma and Grandpa, watching her face light up with excitement I hadn't seen in years. She remembered them, despite the time that had passed, remembered the big house with the garden, and the way my mother used to let her help bake cookies. I should have opened it first. The moment she lifted that photo from the tissue paper, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The little girl in the picture looked about Raven's age, with blonde curls and pale skin, sitting in the exact spot where Raven used to sit during our visits. She was wearing a dress that looked expensive, the kind my mother used to hint I should buy for Raven but could never afford. The happiness in my parents' faces as they posed with this new child was unmistakable. Genuine joy I'd never seen them show with my daughter. But it was the note that made my vision blur with rage. Not just the words, but what they represented. A deliberate message that they'd replaced us, that they'd found a better version of what we could have been. They'd sent this to a 7-year-old child, knowing exactly how it would make her feel. That night, after I'd held Raven while she cried herself to sleep asking why Grandma and Grandpa didn't love her anymore, I sat on my bedroom floor with my back against the closed door and let myself fall apart completely. The cruelty was so precise, so calculated to wound both of us in the deepest possible way, that I couldn't understand how people I'd once called family could have planned it so deliberately. I almost called them, almost dialed their number at 2 in the morning to scream at them, to demand an explanation, to beg them to tell me why they'd want to hurt an innocent child. But something stopped me, maybe exhaustion, maybe the knowledge that they'd enjoy knowing how much damage they'd inflicted. Instead, I found myself thinking about my great-aunt Dolores, my mother's sister who died when I was 12. She'd been the only family member who ever stood up to my parents, the one who used to tell me privately that their behavior wasn't normal, wasn't acceptable. At family gatherings, she'd watch their interactions with me and shake her head, sometimes pulling me aside afterward to remind me that I was worthy of love and respect. I remembered something she'd told me once, when I was about 15 and my parents had humiliated me in front of the entire family for some minor teenage transgression. She'd said that people who need to hurt children to feel powerful are the weakest people in the world, and the best revenge against weak people is to become so strong they can't touch you anymore. In that moment, sitting on my bedroom floor at 3 in the morning, I felt something shift inside me. Not just anger, but a cold, clear understanding of exactly who my parents were and what they deserved. My first idea was simple: post the photo and note on social media, let our extended family see what kind of people my parents really were. But when I sat down to write the post, I realized it would just look like petty family drama, and somehow I'd end up looking like the unstable one. My parents were skilled at making themselves look reasonable, while painting me as the problem. The breakthrough came while I was at work 3 days later. I was caring for an elderly patient whose family had been fighting over his care, and I watched how the hospital social worker documented every interaction, every concerning behavior, every instance of potential neglect or abuse. The precision of her notes, the way she built a case through careful observation and documentation, gave me an idea. I started researching. I found out that the little girl in the photo, Isabella, was my cousin Marcus's daughter from his second marriage. My parents had apparently inserted themselves into her life after Marcus moved back to town, positioning themselves as the devoted grandparents they'd never been to Raven. Social media posts going back months showed them at her dance recitals, her school events, family dinners where she sat in the place that used to belong to my daughter. My first attempt at confrontation was a disaster. I called my mother directly, thinking I'd give her a chance to explain, maybe even apologize. Instead, she acted like she had no idea why I was upset. She said they had a right to have relationships with other grandchildren, that maybe if I'd been a better daughter, things would be different. When I mentioned how the photo had made Raven cry, she actually laughed and said maybe it would teach her that actions have consequences. That laugh stayed with me for days. The casual cruelty of it, The complete lack of empathy for a 7-year-old child. It crystallized something for me. This wasn't about reconnection or teaching lessons. This was about power, about punishment, about making sure we knew we were replaceable. The opportunity came 6 weeks later, at my cousin Marcus's wife's baby shower. I hadn't planned to go, but my Aunt Linda called and practically begged me to attend, saying the family missed me and it was time to put old grudges behind us. She didn't know about the photo, didn't understand why I'd been absent from family events. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. The shower was at a country club banquet hall, filled with women from both sides of the family, everyone cooing over tiny clothes and pastel decorations. My parents were there, of course, positioned prominently at the head table with Isabella on my mother's lap. They looked so respectable, so grandparent-like, accepting congratulations on their devotion to family. I waited until the gift opening was finished, until the crowd had settled into casual conversation over cake and coffee. Then I approached the microphone that had been set up for the games and toasts. My hands were steady as I tapped it gently to get everyone's attention. I started by congratulating Marcus and his wife on their growing family, mentioning how wonderful it was to see everyone gathered together. Then I shared how touched I'd been to receive a recent gift from my parents, something that had really shown me their true feelings about family and grandchildren. I pulled out my phone and showed the room the photo they'd sent to Raven. I read the note aloud, word for word, letting the cruelty of it settle over the room. I explained how this had been delivered to my 7-year-old daughter as a birthday gift, how she'd cried herself to sleep asking why she wasn't good enough to be their granddaughter anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see people looking back and forth between me and my parents, could see the expressions changing from confusion to horror. My mother's face had gone white, and my father was staring at his hands. Isabella, sensing the tension, had started to fidget in my mother's lap. I mentioned that I'd been wondering if other family members knew about this new tradition of replacing grandchildren, if anyone else had received photos of substitute family members when they fell out of favor. Then I thanked everyone for their time and walked out of the room, leaving the photo on the podium for anyone who wanted a closer look. The calls started within hours. Aunt Linda first, horrified and apologetic, saying she'd had no idea about the photo, no understanding of how deep the rift had become. Then my cousin David, my uncle Robert, family friends who'd been at the shower. Each conversation revealed how completely my parents had rewritten the story of our estrangement, painting me as the difficult daughter who'd kept their granddaughter away from them out of spite. Marcus called the next day, his voice tight with anger. Not at his parents, but at me, for embarrassing the family at his wife's baby shower. He said I'd always been dramatic, that maybe the photo was insensitive, but I didn't have to humiliate everyone publicly. When I asked him how he'd feel if someone sent his daughter a replacement family photo, he hung up on me. My parents never called to explain or apologize. Instead, I heard through other family members that they were telling people I'd taken the gift out of context, that it was just a photo and I'd overreacted as usual. My mother apparently told several relatives that she'd always known I was mentally unstable, that this outburst proved she'd been right to distance herself from me. But something had shifted in the family dynamic. The relatives who called weren't just offering perfunctory sympathy. They were genuinely disturbed by what they'd witnessed. Aunt Linda started inviting Raven and me to her house for Sunday dinners. Cousin David began including us in his children's birthday parties. People who'd been distant for years suddenly seemed to see us clearly for the first time. Raven stopped asking about the photo after a few weeks. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel secure in their primary relationships. She started talking more about the aunt and cousins who actually wanted to spend time with her, who saw her value without conditions or comparisons. Sometimes I wonder if my parents understand what they lost when they chose cruelty over love. But then I remember that photo, the deliberate care they took in selecting it, writing that note, wrapping it beautifully before sending it to a child, and I realize they know exactly what they're doing. The most unexpected part of exposing toxic family behavior isn't the backlash from the perpetrators. It's discovering how many other people have been watching and waiting for someone to speak the truth out loud. The relatives who'd seemed indifferent were actually just afraid to rock the boat, waiting for permission to acknowledge what they'd been seeing all along. Raven is 8 now, confident and secure in the family that chose to embrace her fully. When people ask about her grandparents, she matter-of-factly explains that some people aren't very good at loving children, but she has an aunt and cousins who are excellent at it. She doesn't dwell on rejection because she's surrounded by acceptance. Maybe that's the real victory. Not the public exposure or the family realignment, but raising a child who understands her own worth so clearly that other people's cruelty can't diminish it. She knows now that love isn't something you have to earn through perfect behavior or genetic compatibility. The people who truly belong in your life don't send photos of your replacements. They show up consistently, flaws and all, because that's what real family does.